Video number 2, chapter number 10, we are dealing with the life of the prophet. He has received messages from God that he's going to bring back to the community, and of course he does bring these messages back. And what happens? People are not really very happy about these messages. He gets some followers, a handful, a couple dozen, a few dozen followers, many of them people he already knew, Khadijah, his wife, for example, and some other members of his family and his household and so forth. But the mainstream society does not accept what's going on here. They do not like Muhammad's message, and they don't like him, frankly, as an individual. Why? There's a couple things to understand. Number one, remember that this city, a large part of its success, financial success, is based on a pagan polytheistic shrine right in the middle of town. So, you know that people are not going to want to hear all pagans are wrong and we need to get rid of paganism, because that's going to hurt a lot of people. The other thing, and this is a little more subtle to understand, is that Muhammad is alive when all of this is happening. He is coming to people with this message that says, listen, God has a plan for all of us, and I'm going to tell you what that plan is. So if you believe Muhammad, if you're going to follow this faith, you basically have to do what he says. You have to follow along with the teachings that he's presenting, because he speaks for God. So you can't sort of say, well, I sort of agree with God here, but I disagree there. It's God, so what are you going to do? So unless you want to follow Muhammad, unless you trust him as an individual, you're not going to want to be part of this tradition necessarily. The things get even worse by 619. Well, during the same year, Khadijah, remember his wife who's been very supportive through all this, she dies. His uncle, who had taken him in and helped protect him and so forth, he dies. And now Muhammad is very much alone in some important ways. He has followers and so forth, but he's at a very vulnerable time in his life. And if things had gone a different way, we probably wouldn't be talking about Islam as a world religion. But what becomes significant is that some people from another community outside of Mecca approach Muhammad and they say, listen, we've heard that you are preaching this message of one God, you're preaching this message of community and unity, and that you are in need of people to follow this message, essentially. So what they propose is that Muhammad moves himself and his followers to a neighboring community called Yathrib. Now, this is today the city referred to as Medina, but it doesn't have that name until later because that refers to Muhammad having lived there. So this town of Yathrib, we'll just call it Medina for simplicity's sake. This town of Medina says, come, be a leader in our community because we have some really deep problems with divisions and infighting and these blood feuds that have formed between different families and different tribes in the community, and we need a unifier. So come, be with us, unify, and convert some people to your message. And so this is what happens. And in the year 622, the Muslim community moves from Mecca to Medina. And this is very important. This is what's referred to as the Hijra. And this is, well, this is literally the beginning of Islam. When you look at the Islamic calendar, they don't measure their years from the birth of Muhammad. They don't measure their years from when he got his message. They measure their years from when this move took place. From Mecca to Medina. Now, why? Because Islam only exists in its full form as a community religion. It's intended to be a religion of a group of people. It's intended to be a religion of all the people who are servants of God, who submit to the will of God. But it only functions at a community level in its fullest form. And so this is the first time Islam has really had a chance to flourish as a community religion. And flourish it does. And over the course of the next several years, there is tension between Medina, where Muhammad, the prophet, is having success, where the community has come to follow him, to become very devoted to him. And there's conflict with Mecca, the town where he came from. They still see him as a problem. They see him as somebody they want to get rid of. And a series of battles, skirmishes, and all-out battles between 624 and 630 or so, they happen between these two communities. At the beginning, Medina succeeds, but only against great odds. They sort of miraculously succeed by fighting against a larger force from Mecca that's kind of trying to basically raid them while they're out traveling. And this little force from Medina succeeds, and this really sort of sets the stage. There's a couple things going on here which we might as well mention. One, this of course is very symbolically important for the people, because they see this as a stamp of approval from God. We beat this superior foe because God was on our side. From a purely military point of view, what's happening here is that Medina is organized in a way that Mecca isn't. Medina follows one leader, follows one ideology, follows one message, whereas Mecca is more divided into these tribal interests and all the different concerns and trying to get the best out of each situation for your group and so forth. And so Medina is able to take on larger forces. It's just a military reality that a small organized force can often defeat a large disorganized force. Well, this process of Medina defeating Mecca goes for years and years, well, I mean about half a decade, a little over half a decade, with Medina gaining and gaining and gaining in superiority. Until finally in 630, and by the way, I give you all these years just so you have a sense of the chronology. You don't need to know the specific years, as long as you know 6th century, 7th century, that's fine with me. By the year 630, Mecca lets Muhammad return, lets him take the city over, basically. They no longer try to stand against him. He has too many followers, too much support, and it's not to the advantage of Mecca anymore to try to resist what he's teaching, to resist this message. And so what does Muhammad do when he comes back to Mecca? He goes to that polytheistic pagan shrine, and he clears out all the polytheistic pagan idols, and he rededicates it in the name of God. Allah is the term for God in Islam, but it's just the word God. Same thing, Christians worship God, Jews worship God, and Muslims worship God. It's just the Arabic term is Allah. So, he rededicates it to God. And by the way, it's probably worth noting, this is not seen as him taking over a pagan temple. The idea is that in the ancient past, this spot marked this legacy of interaction between humans and God. So this is where Adam first interacted with God, and then a long time later, Abraham rededicated this spot in the name of God, and then it became corrupt, and then now Muhammad is rededicating it in the name of God. And if you ever see pictures of Muslims walking about that big black cube in the city of Mecca, that's the Kaaba. That's actually a piece of fabric hanging around the outside of the Kaaba, but the Kaaba is the building that's inside there. So it's still crucially important, a central sort of physical location of Islam in the world today. So, all right, it's the year 630. Muhammad has returned victorious to his home city. He has an enormous following and so forth. Everything looks great, except he dies. He dies a couple years later. And now Islam needs to find new leadership, and this is a very difficult thing for Islam. Islam is led by a series of individuals, 4 men, referred to as the rightly guided caliphs during this time. Caliph is just a term for this religious authority. And the rightly guided caliphs are seen, well, obviously they're called rightly guided, so they're generally seen as important figures in leading the community after Muhammad died, as being on the right path. They're all people who knew Muhammad in life. They're all people who were either selected by the community or appointed by their predecessor. So this isn't like a hereditary role where somebody's son gets to take over for his father and then his grandson and so forth. This is people choosing their leaders stage after stage. But make no mistake, this is still a time of great turmoil, because of these 4 rightly guided caliphs, 3 of them get assassinated. So obviously there's a great deal of discontent, there's a great deal of confusion during this time as well. Now, in order to talk about Islam, we need to talk about something called the 5 pillars. And I'm going to very briefly start on this here, and I'll wrap up in the other videos. The first of these 5 pillars is what's referred to as the profession of faith. And this is simply saying that you acknowledge that there is only one God, and that Muhammad is the prophet of that God. So usually in English this is said, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Some version of that. And that's essentially what it means to be Muslim. If you say that, and you believe it, you're Muslim. Now, you may be a good Muslim or a bad Muslim based on all sorts of other things, but that's it. And that's also a central symbol of Islam. It's what you say to a newborn baby. It's what you hope you will be saying when you die. It's something you will say every day of your adult life. It is the heart of Islam, recognizing that there is only one God and believing that Muhammad is the prophet of that God. All right, that's it for video number 2. I will see you in video number 3.